The Flash Season 9 had finally found its feet with the last two episodes being what is probably the first time since Crisis on Infinite Earths where we got a 2 good episode in a row streak, but from everything we knew about this episode, the streak did not look like it was going to continue, and yeah, it didn't. This video is a review of The Flash Season 9 Episode 11 titled A New World Part 2, The Blues, which despite being the third to last episode of The Flash ever, it barely features The Flash, it barely features its main character. This has been one of the many different prevailing and consistent issues with this season, as Eric Wallace doesn't seem to view Barry Allen as the main character of his own show. Instead, he seems to treat the show as an ensemble, with every supporting character deserving to be the main character of at least one episode. And sure, in a 23 episode long season, focusing on one other character for an episode is fine. It's not ideal, those episodes never really end up being interesting, but at least there is room for that. This season has 13 episodes, and this particular arc has 4. There's no room for an episode like this. It's unforgivable for the third to last episode of The Flash to barely feature The Flash. Which is particularly bad for this show because it has such a bad supporting cast, which becomes so evident when the only scenes Barry did have in this episode were more interesting than any scene that focused on that cast. The few seconds we saw Barry in his suit was the best moment of the episode visually, because the suit looks great, especially in good lighting, which the scene did have, and the scene where he talked about the previous episode, how he dreaded the moment he would need to live that night again, but now instead he was at peace, echoing what I said in my last review, which is that Barry won that night, not Thawne. Those scenes are some of the best in this episode, and those are the only 2 scenes Barry actually appears in. There is one more, but he's not actually the focus of that scene either, so it's very evident that Barry not being a part of this show, his show, especially the third to last episode of the season, is a very big mistake. Actually, that particular scene where Barry talked about the previous episode had another one of the Flash Season 9's consistent issues, the goddamn flashbacks. This season seems to somehow out-flashback itself again and again. I think I mentioned in 2 previous reviews how that episode had more flashbacks than any other episode, but I think this one has even more, as it feels like it's maybe 10% flashback. Obviously, that's hyperbole, but honestly, whether it be Keon reminiscing over Mark, Eddie remembering his life and death, or flashbacks to the literal previous episode, which happened more than once, this episode is jam-packed with the stuff, which is an unfortunate added issue to an already not very interesting episode. Okay, maybe that is a bit unfair. The episode does barely feature the Flash, but it's not exactly filler. It has a leg up on any typical episode that focuses on the supporting characters, because there's an entire, far more interesting side storyline involving Eddie Thawne as set up for the main villain, although there's only 2 episodes left, so he's not really going to be the main villain for long. None of what we saw here was as cool as the negative origin of the Flash in the previous episode, or at least it didn't reach that initial peak, but it is certainly the most interesting part of this episode, and it definitely carries the episode past being absolute hot garbage. I did like the CCPD's initial reactions to Eddie. That wasn't a bad way to start the episode, even if 2049 is probably too far into the future for people to so instinctively remember his face. However, Eddie remembering his life throughout the episode while losing his mind over it was pretty cool, and the flashbacks involved were definitely the least annoying flashbacks since they actually contributed to the plot and also didn't have that annoying blue tint, thankfully. They definitely have a lot to explain about Eddie, how he's alive and in 2049, where that bullet came from in the end, and why he was chosen as the new Avatar. It does feel optimistic to think that they will successfully explain all of this, as there is this huge plot hole in the Red Death arc that they never explained where Batwoman was, so it feels like maybe they will never explain any of this. Hopefully they do, as if they don't, it would be particularly unfortunate. However, yes, this whole storyline involving Eddie Thawne was definitely a lot more interesting than anything else, and definitely the part of the episode that I was the most engaged in, and also the actor who plays Eddie did a good job here. The rest of the episode focusing on the supporting characters, it was disappointing. Barry not appearing in any substantial role, that's always going to be a disappointing episode of The Flash. Hell, even Grant Gustin thinks so. The plot also doesn't end up actually mattering, at least for the plot of the arc. I mean, it does matter for certain characters, but not the Cobalt Blue arc or the New World arc, since the Blue Stone, it just disappears in the end. It's really just telling us what happened while Barry was in the past, but I don't think that was necessary. He he could have just returned to the moment that he left from. What it does matter for is Keon, who in this episode is pretty consistently referred to as Keone, which is really weird, but also she comes to this realization that she's a goddess, I guess the life force or something. Honestly, like I've said like 12 times at this point, I could not care less about this character. And that's just by default. Honestly, as a Keon storyline goes, this might be a bit worse than I expected, because at the end of the episode, she's being portrayed as more important or above Team Flash, more important than Barry, which is just such a slap in the face to what this show is supposed to be about. I guess in the end, one of the supporting characters is going to end up being more important than the Flash, and this is a character who was created for the show, not from the comics. Also, Cecile has at least 3 of her classic throw-up inducing emotion reading, which no matter how little we get of that, even if there is just one, it will probably lower from the score of the episode, because you can't have a perfect episode with something like that there. There's nothing that makes my eye roll more than that. That being said, while that part of the episode was never going to be good, there were things that I did admittedly enjoy. For instance, while Mark returning was unnecessary, honestly I felt like his whole character was unnecessary, but his departure was relatively effective. So bringing him back, it was unnecessary. He never needed to come back. However, John Core did a good job of portraying the negative Speed Force afflicted Chillblaine as he tries to systematically emotionally manipulate the team. Honestly, I kind of enjoyed Chillblaine's part of that whole supporting cast arc, because I couldn't care less about these characters, so having one of them become a different character makes them more interesting. In fact, the first roast, which was of Keone, felt so weird and out of character that the reveal that Chillblaine is possessed was actually kind of cool, although that particular argument came out of this very poorly acted and very poorly written scene in the Central City Citizen where they're all scared of Keon. I didn't like that scene at all. However, everything to do with Chillblaine in this episode, that was actually genuinely not bad. Also, I kind of like the scene where Chillblaine turned to sand, if nothing else because it looks kind of sick. I still do not care about Keon's powers or anything, but I think that effect actually looked kind of cool. I did mention that the scene where Barry actually shows up as the Flash was the best moment visually, but this does take a second place. It's the best visually that you could get with these characters without actually involving the Flash in costume. I also kind of like Iris's scenes in this storyline, as Barry's disappearance brings up memories of how he was supposed to disappear in the Crisis, which connects nicely to her being extremely pregnant at this point, since the original Nora Allen grew up without a father. Also, her being pregnant could explain why she is reacting the way she is. And I've said this before, but I think that Iris West is definitely the best of the supporting characters because, well, for one, she matters, but also Candice Patton is a relatively good actress. I think you can derive a lot of good scenes from her and her relationship with Barry, and she has definitely grown on me over the years, if nothing else because she is infinitely better than the rest of the supporting cast. In conclusion, this episode was just never going to be good because it barely features Barry, which is extra annoying considering this is the third to last episode ever. It also doesn't help that the main plot ended up being mostly pointless. Keon's whole existence, let alone her development, is the most irrelevant thing to ever happen on this show. Cecile uses her powers a few times, and the episode is absolutely plagued with flashbacks, but at least Eddie Thawne's side storyline was decent. Barry had a good scene or two, Iris had a few good scenes, and the supporting cast story wasn't as bad as it could have been. Unfortunately, this does break the good episode streak anyway, as I'd give the episode a 4 out of 10. Thankfully though, the next episode does actually look pretty good.